One simply does not have a spooky season without talking about the king of horror himself. Hello everyone, welcome back to A Fictional Escapist. My name is Kris and today's video is about my Stephen King favourite reads and also my priority list for my TBR for Mr. King. Quick note, this chair will not be in all the videos going forward. Don't worry, I'm just cleaning up my office, so it is awkward in here at this moment. And before we jump into the content, make sure you're checking the description box down below for links to my social media and Discord should you want to come along for the ride. I've got 3 parts to this video today. I'm going to go through 5 underrated Stephen King books, underrated in my opinion, my 5 favourites, and also my top 5 priority reads for Mr. King. The reason I'm going to start off with some underrated Stephen King books is because I think my favourites tend to align with a lot of other people's favourites, and you've probably heard about them 100 times before, but maybe you haven't heard about some of those reads that I think are really decent inside the multiverse, but don't really get all that much recognition. So we're going to jump into those 5 first. The first one on my underrated list is not a horror book at all, or I guess atmospheric horror, and that is Joyland. Joyland is part of the Hard Case Crime series along with Colorado Kid and most recently Later. I have heard some criticism for these books. They're pretty easy to read and not all that much goes on in them, but Joyland was a really good time for me personally. Very much a fan of sort of like this slow atmospheric horror in a place like a carnival or a theme park, and it was a crime story that was really creepy and I had a super good time with it. Also, very fast read. I think these books are like 250 pages and I had a really good time. So if you're not sure whether you like Stephen King and you want to maybe give a hard case crime novel a go, I would definitely recommend Joyland if you align with my reading tastes. The next underrated King I have now, all these books are beaten up because I stole them from my dad's storage when I was much younger and moving out of home. So forgive these books, they're all like 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th hand and they're just beat up at this stage. But the second underrated Stephen King book that I have on my list is Dolores Claiborne, I think is how you pronounce that name. This is a little bit different for King. This is basically a woman, so Dolores, who is telling her story of a crime that she committed. The back of this one says, Dolores Claiborne has a story to tell, but not quite what the police had expected. Dolores Claiborne has a confession to make. She will take her time, she won't be hurried, she will do it her way, sparing neither details or feelings, hers or anyone else's. This is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Truth that takes you to the edge of darkness. Dolores Claiborne has a story to tell, and you'd better pay attention, or else. This is essentially told in a first-person monologue, which is something I've not come across a whole lot, and I had such a good time with it. I highly recommend it if you're new to King and you want to sort of jump in with something a little bit easier to read. This is a good one to go to, also quite short at 307 pages. The next one I want to recommend as an underrated Stephen King read is The Dark Half. This one says, they were laughing at the burial. Tad Beaumont, writer, and his wife, he with a spade, she with a pick, laughing at the camera. Between them the tombstone and the inscription. George Stark, 1975 to 1987. Not a very nice guy. A joke, a publicity stunt for the papers because Tad Beaumont, literary writer, had created George Stark as a cover name for the violent thrillers he'd written to earn some quick, much-needed money. But enough was enough. The cover was about to be blown, so he decided to kill off his other self. But George Stark didn't want to go, and Stark was a very violent man indeed. This is a kind of cool Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde playoff. I had a really fun time with this book. It's probably one of the more fun Stephen King books that I have read, and I would recommend giving this one a go if you have not already. There is still some of that slice of life stuff in here, but it doesn't take itself super seriously. Up next is a book that I read fairly recently, I think early last year, or it may even have been my introduction to Bookstagram, and that is Revival. This one also follows like a sort of minister or a creepy churchy trope. We have sort of like showman carnival themes in there as well, and it was just overall really fun. This was sort of one of the first more modern Stephen Kings that I've read that I've had a really good time with. The back of this one says, the new minister came to Harlow, Maine when Jamie Morton was a boy, doing battle with his toy toy army men on the front lawn. The young Reverend Charles Jacobs and his beautiful wife brought new life to the local church and captivated their congregation. But with Jamie, he shares a secret obsession, a draw so powerful it would have profound consequences 5 decades after the shattering tragedy that turned their preacher against God, and long after his final scathing sermon. Now Jamie, a nomadic rock guitarist hooked on heroin, meets Charles Jacobs again, and when their bond becomes a pact beyond even the devil's devising, Jamie discovers that the word revival has many meanings. So this is sort of like one of those classic Stephen King slice of life books where we have a young boy meeting this young priest, something happens, they split apart, and then they meet up again as adults, and things ensue, and it's horrific. This is one of the very few Stephen King books that I would say he actually doesn't do too badly with the ending. In my opinion, Stephen King does suffer from some awful endings, but we still read him. We still read him because we like the slice of life stuff, or at least I do. And the last one that I think is super underrated is Insomnia. This is such a good book, and I hardly hear anyone talk about it, even amongst Stephen King fans. But this is probably up there with, if I was going 6 favorites, this would be number 6. This one says, you'll lose a lot of sleep. Ralph does. At first he starts waking earlier and earlier. Then the hallucinations start, the colours, shapes and strange auras, not to mention the bold doctors who always turn up at the scene of death. That's when Ralph begins to lose a lot more sleep, when he begins to understand why his mild-mannered friend Ed is getting out of control, dangerously so, and why his hometown is about to become the new Armageddon. An evil of unimaginable proportions has found its way in, and Ralph has only one chance to beat it. The stakes are high, they always are when you're playing for human souls, with a joker in the pack, a bald one, and a rusty scalpel. And Insomnia is one that I wouldn't mind rereading at some point. Next up, we're going over my 5 favourite Stephen King reads to date, and there are still quite a few that I haven't read. So, the first one up on my list for my Stephen King favourites is The Green Mile. These are so old that they came in magazines as a 6-part series where you got one each week. They weren't one big book yet, it was all an episodic novella tale. This one, for the most part, takes place in a jail cell. It is the Cold Mountain Penitentiary, and it says, at Cold Mountain Penitentiary, along the lonely stretch of cells known as the Green Mile, condemned killers such as Billy the Kid, Killy the Beard Wharton, and the possessed Edward Delacroix await death strapped in Old Sparky. But good and evil, innocent or guilty, prisoner or guard, none has ever seen the brutal likes of the new prisoner, John Coffrey, sentenced to death for raping and murdering 2 young girls. Is Coffrey a devil in human form, or is he a far, far different kind of being? There are more wonders in heaven and hell than anyone at Cold Mountain can imagine, and one of those wonders might just have stepped in amongst them. This was such a brutal story. This one hurt, so if you do like a good gut punch, then this is definitely a good book to read. You can read them in this form, or you can go out and just get the full book. And the movie was also excellent, one of the best Stephen King adaptations that I have seen personally. Next up on my favourites list is book 4 in the Dark Tower series. This is Wizard and Glass. And for those of you who haven't read too much of the Dark Tower, I'm not going to go too much into detail. There are some people who do have some issues with this book, and I can certainly understand why those issues are there and why they're in place. I love this book because I love the why. I love the why people are the way that they are. And this book takes Roland, our protagonist from books 1 to 3, and the person who's banding this group or this quartet together, and takes a look back at his childhood and why he is the way that he is. And I'm such a sucker for that. So that is why Wizard and Glass is here for me. I get to take a good look at this character and why he acts the way that he does and get a little bit more context. This book can be very, very slow for people because it is very much a middle book with a slice of life sort of flow to it. So I definitely understand that. There is also some emphasis on a young woman in particular, if I'm remembering correctly, which can upset some people, and I certainly understand why that is the case here. Stephen King does have a bit of a knack for some questionable scenes with young ladies, and I can understand why this would upset some people. But for me, I really enjoyed that look at Roland as a kid and sort of where he's come from and that slice of life aspect. The next one I don't have a physical copy of. I think I lent it to someone and never got it back, but at this point I've bought it 3 times, so I refuse to buy it again, and that is Pet Sematary. If you, like I said before with Green Mile, if you like a gut punch, Pet Sematary is going to deliver that to you. And it's probably one of the best endings to a Stephen King book, arguably, that I have read personally. So this one is sort of like a classic, I guess, haunted house or haunted area story. You've got a family moving into an old house. It's a little bit creepy, and a family pet gets run over, and they go and bury it in the pet cemetery because the kids were devastated, and the cat comes back to life. You can see where this is going. I'm not going to give too much away. It is one of the best books, probably one of my favorite books that I have read in all time. I think it is one of those books that you really get more of. I have read this one 2 or 3 times, maybe 3 times at this point, and it just gets better every time you read it, and it's not something that I say very often, so I really enjoyed Pet Sematary. The 4th book on my favorites list is the first Stephen King that I ever read, and I think that most people, if they're a Stephen King fan, the first Stephen King book is always going to be one of your favorites, and for me, that was Misery. I read this at 12 or 13, I think I just started high school here in Australia, and I remember sneaking under the house to look at the books because I was reading kids' books at that time, or young adult books, and I wanted something that was going to challenge me. And I remember picking up Misery by Stephen King and also Rain by V.C. Andrews, and they were both adult books, both in storage, and I just picked them up. And I was reading this one under the covers by flashlight because I didn't want my parents to know that I'd gone and nicked an adult book. This has one of the most horrific scenes to this date that I have read in a book, and they didn't put it in the movie. So if you have seen the movie but you've not read the book, read the book. This is about a super fan for Paul Sheldon, I think his name was, if I'm remembering that correctly, and she basically doesn't like how he ended his series because he's a writer, and she kidnaps him. And it's a really interesting play on Stockholm Syndrome. So, if that isn't enough to grip you, it is one of my favorites. I have read this twice now, and I think I'm due for a reread of Misery, and I'm glad I found this sort of old beat-up copy, because I feel like books like this need to have old beat-up copies. Also, Kathy Bates as Annie, just chef kiss. Pick this one up or you're a dirty bird. The next one that I have, and the last one I have, which is a shock to no Stephen King fan, and it is probably still my favorite book to date, is The Stand. Absolute behemoth of a book. This is over 1,300 pages in the abridged version. This is a post-apocalyptic world, very heavy on characters, very heavy on slice of life. I won't go too much into detail because I'm sure you've heard of it at this stage. Also, the original adaptation of The Stand is so much better than the one with Eric, what's-his-face from True Blood. What's his real name? Alexander Skarsgård. Got it. Watch the original one. More true to form, in my opinion, than the new one. You like slice of life, you like a post-apocalyptic world where nothing is going as it seems. It is a ultimate fight for good and evil. I love The Stand. But that is my top pick for Stephen King and my favourite book of all time to this date. I'm nervous about reading Swan Song because I hear it's compared to The Stand a lot, and what if I like it more? I don't know what to do with myself then, so we'll see. Which brings me to my last section of this video, my top Stephen King priority list. What are the next 5 books from Mr. King that I want to get to? Well, the first is very beat up and is actually in my unhaul pile for the next time I do an unhaul video, and I'll get an e-copy, and that is Under the Dome. Look at this thing. This was stored by my father so poorly, it's like... Anyway, I'm going to bin this one and get an e-copy of it. So this is another one of those Stephen Kings that is huge and intimidating. And because it is something like 1,000 pages long, I haven't picked it up yet, but it is probably the one that I'm most interested in reading. So this one, I cannot find the blurb on it because it is so beat up. I'm going to read it off Goodreads. Under the Dome is the story of a small town of Chester's Mill, Maine. Shockingly, it's set in Maine, which is inexplicably and suddenly sealed off from the rest of the world by an invisible force field. No one can get in and no one can get out. When food, electricity and water run short, the normal rules of society are changed. A new and more sinister social order develops. Dale Barbara, a young Iraq veteran, teams up with a handful of intrepid citizens to fight against the corruption that is sweeping through the town and to try and discover the source of the dome before it's too late. Creepy small town vibes. Love it, here for it. That is very high on my list. The next one I have on my list is 4 Past Midnight, and this is why they haven't been on TBRs, because they're so friggin' long, and the font is not small. This one clocks just under 1,000 pages, so that is a big ask as well to fit on anyone's TBR. At midnight comes the point of balance of danger, the instant of utter stillness when between two beats of the heart an alternative reality can slip through like a blade between the ribs and switch you into a new and terrifying world. 4 Past Midnight, 4 heart-stopping accounts of that moment when the familiar world fractures beyond sense, the fragments spinning away from the desperate, clutching reach of sanity. It sounds excellent. I have had this on my shelf for close to 15 years now. I'm 31 now, so whenever I basically stole all these books from my dad's storage, I just have not read it. The next 2 I have talked about before. I wanted to potentially put them on a TBR, but I just never got around to them, and the first one being Christine. I have not gotten to this one, but I have had it for a very long time. Christine was eating into his mind, burrowing into his unconsciousness. Last night I had a dream again, only in this one Christine was old. No, not just old, she was ancient, a terrible hulk of a car. Something you'd expect to see in a tarot pack, instead of the Hanged Man, the death car. The engine roared and missed and jetted filthy blue oil smoke. It wasn't empty. Roland Dillabay was lolling behind the wheel. His eyes were open and they were glazed and dead. Each time the engine revved and Christine's rust-eaten body vibrated, he flopped like a rag doll, his peeling skull nodding back and forth. Christine, blood red, fat and finned, was 20. Her promise lay all in her past. Girl same. Greedy and big, she was Arnie's obsession. A 58 Plymouth Fury, sorry car lovers. Broken down but not finished. There was still power in her, a frightening power that leaked like sump oil, staining and corrupting. A malign power that corroded the mind and turned ownership into possession. My dog has eaten parts of this book. There are dog teethy marks all over this book, but that is one I'm looking forward to, much like Rose Madder is the next one on my list. I know nothing about this book except this man is turning into some form of cow. Do I need to know more going into this book? I absolutely do not need to know more going into this book. Roused by a single drop of blood, Rosie someone, because the back is damaged, wakes up to the chilling realization that her husband is going to kill her. That sucks. And she takes flight with his credit card. Well, sucks for him. Alone in a strange city, Rosie begins to build a new life. She meets Bill Steiner and she finds an odd junk shop painting, Rose Madder, which strangely seems to want her as much as she wants it. But it's hard for Rosie not to keep looking over her shoulder. Rose maddened and on the rampage, Norman is a corrupt cop with a dog's instinct for tracking people, and he's getting close. Rosie can feel just how close he's getting. A brilliant, dark-hued fable of the gender wars, a haunting love story, and a hold your breath until you gasp triumph of suspense. Rose Madder is Stephen King at his electrifying best. I mean, he then wrote Revival, which is actually electrifying, so we'll see. But that one is pretty high on my list as well. The last one that I have on my list, which I have heard talked about a little bit here on BookTube, is 11/22/63 as a time-jumping series. I believe this is around the JFK assassination. Yep, because on November 22, 1963, 3 shots rang out in Dallas. President Kennedy died and the world changed. If you had the chance to change history, would you? Would the consequences be worth it? I have heard some praise for this one. Again, it is quite large and quite chunky, so I don't know when I'm going to get to it, but it is on the priority list. That is a lot of Stephen King. Have you read any of these? What are your favorite Stephen King books? Let me know in those comments down below. If you like the content, give it one of those. If you want to see more of it, click subscribe at your will, and I'll catch you in the next video. Ciao.